Thank you so much for joining in, sir. How do you interpret the Zelensky-Trump Oval Office meeting and the subsequent huddle with European leaders, substance versus optics, given the stalemate on core issues?
Well, I think things are moving forward. Of course, there are extremely difficult issues still to be resolved. But uh, first of all, you have to remember that as late, well, until Trump came to office, the Europeans were still saying, as were the Ukrainians, that the only terms of peace would be complete Russian withdrawal from all the territory that it occupied in Ukraine. And they were also talking about, you know, war crimes trials and so on, and none of which was remotely practicable. So that obviously has changed. As late as this summer, as I found when traveling in Europe, the Europeans were refusing to engage with concrete peace proposals at all. And of course, until uh, a couple of weeks ago, uh, Trump was insisting that you had to have a prior ceasefire before actually, negotiating on a peace settlement, which the Russians had made clear from the word go was that they were never going to accept, for the obvious reason that, Russia is advancing on the battlefield slowly, and that this is the only real means of leverage that Russia has in negotiations. So they're obviously not going to give that up. When Ukraine was advancing on the battlefield, the Ukrainians refused to agree to a prior ceasefire. So, this isn't a particularly Russian thing. Um, on the Russian side, compared to the terms that Putin put forward to the Ukrainians in June, the Russians have abandoned the demand that the Ukrainians withdraw from the whole of Zaporizhia and Kherson provinces, and they appear to have accepted that there will be continued Western arms supplies to Ukraine, something that in June they were still excluding. So the Russians have moved a certain distance as well. Um, but of course, there are we a the Russians are still demanding Ukrainian withdrawal from the whole of Donetsk province, which looks impossible for the Ukrainians. And we do not know on other issues just how far they are negotiable. Um, what are the Russians still demanding in terms of arms limitations on the Ukrainian armed forces? Are the Russians still demanding what they call denazification? And on the Western side, are the Europeans and the Ukrainians going to go on trying to insist on European troops in Ukraine, which, as far as I know, is still completely unacceptable to the Russians? So there has been movement, but there is still a great deal to discuss.
Right, sir. From your vantage point, what are the real sticking points on security guarantees for Ukraine and how they might be structured to be credible yet acceptable to Moscow?
Well, the thing is that a lot of this talk of security guarantees by the West seems to me empty because every NATO government, including the previous Biden administration, stated repeatedly that they would not go to war to defend Ukraine. And that remains their position, and that is supported by a majority of European publics as well. Well, that being said, so that there cannot be anything like an absolute guarantee of Ukrainian security. Um, all there can be is continued Western arms supplies to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians build up the strongest possible force uh, to resist and therefore to deter future Russian aggression. Now, as I've said, I mean, previously the Russians were excluding that. They were calling on the Ukrainians um, uh, to give up any right to receive arms from the West. Well, that's a non-starter. But if you can get the Russians to abandon that point, and you can get the Europeans to promise not to station their own troops in Ukraine, then it seems to me that uh, an an agreement on Ukrainian security is possible. But you know, in history, there is no such thing as an absolute guarantee. Um, partly because, of course, things change. I mean, my God, look at how much has changed in the world over the past 40 years. No guarantee given in 1985 would have any meaning today.
Certainly, sir. So there are two conflicting perspectives: ceasefire versus comprehensive deal. So did Washington's shifting language change keeps leverage on the ground? And how does Russia's incremental advance shape the negotiating calendar?
Well, the Russians are not going to agree to a prior ceasefire. Um, they have said repeatedly a ceasefire has to come as part of an overall settlement. And I see no chance that the Russians will move away from that. I mean, it doesn't have to be a settlement that agrees to every issue. You know, the issues of actual legal sovereignty will have to be left for, endless future negotiation. But the Russians do need some things pinned down. And I think, by the way, that that's correct. I think we should want that as well, because as Trump himself has said, you don't want a ceasefire, an unstable, fragile ceasefire that then breaks down again. You actually want to end this war. Um, and I think that is where we are now. When Chancellor Merz of Germany still stresses the need for a ceasefire, I think he's on autopilot. Um, it's not going to happen. So I think we are now in the business of concrete negotiations on the terms of a peace agreement. Um, and well, some of these issues are very, very difficult. B, some of them are still very unclear. Especially when it comes to Russian demands. We don't actually know. On some things, we act moved from its demands in June, but on others we don't. We don't know exactly what the Russians are calling for, and without knowing that, it's much more difficult to, assess just how possible a peace settlement is. I mean, my own view is that if we were to offer the Russians enough in other areas, when it comes, for example, suspending sanctions, entering into arms control talks, returning Russian assets, seized assets, um, and the Americans, limiting their own uh, forces on Russia's borders. I think if you were to offer the Russians some, enough of that, you could probably get them to drop uh, their territorial demands, not give them up any more than the Ukrainians would give up their demands that Russia withdraw from the territory they occupy, but basically agree that this would have to be left for future negotiation.
Right, sir. On territory and sequencing, is there any realistic pathway that addresses Ukraine's constitutional red lines while testing Russia's willingness to make concessions, or we are headed for a frozen conflict?
Well, there's certainly a big risk of a frozen conflict. But I mean, as I say, I mean, part of the problem is that uh, partly because he does not have professional people on his team to negotiate with the Russians. I mean, Witkoff has far too much on his plate. He's not an expert. He doesn't seem to grasp the details. So now we have a situation in which Trump is basically conducting shuttle diplomacy. Now, it's not unprecedented for a US president to do that. Clinton did that in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in the 1990s. But it's certainly unusual, and it's not necessarily a good idea because, after all, the US president has so much else on his plate. It's very, very difficult to concentrate on, the extremely complicated details that have to be worked out. But I think that if the US would bring forward a plan of its own, meeting Russian requirements in other areas, and tell the Russians, look, for this, you've got to abandon your claim to the whole of, well, your demand that the Ukrainians withdraw from the whole of Donetsk. And basically, look, just take it or leave it. And if you leave it, then, we go on supplying Ukraine, the war continues, and then maybe you'll win. But maybe you won't. I mean, 6 months down the line, it may be that you'll still only have captured one or two small towns in the Donbass, and then you'll have to come back and accept what you could accept today. If the Russians reject that, then the war continues. But if they accept that, then I think that the US would have to go to the Europeans and Ukrainians and say, look, this is the best we can do for you. You want to go on fighting, you go on fighting. But when, Europeans, you go on supporting Ukraine. But without us, we're out of this. And I mean, there are a lot of people in Trump's camp who would like to do that. Of course, there's huge opposition as well, not just from the Democrats, but in the Republican Party. But I think that there is a real possibility that that's the way things will go.
Right, sir. Just one last question, which is a little beyond this topic. President Trump has imposed secondary tariffs on India over purchase of Russian oil. So how do you assess the rationale and likely impact of this move on India's energy security, inflation control, and its larger geopolitical consequences?
Well, I mean, this really illustrates the difficulty the West has in imposing more economic pressure on Russia, because all the Western hardliners are saying, you must ratchet up sanctions, you must cut off Russian oil exports. Well, that has totally failed to take into account the impact on countries, including countries which, of course, above all, India, which were thought to be key US partners. And from what I gather, one of the reasons why, that there is now, this greater push by the US administration for a peace settlement is that they have belatedly realized that this threat of secondary sanctions against India is doing terrible damage to a key US international relationship. Now, they ought to have thought of that before, but they are thinking of it now. And of course, that means that so much of this talk of increasing economic pressure on Russia is empty, because it's not just on Russia, it's on other countries as well. Take these proposals to seize shipments of Russian oil on the high seas, which would be completely illegal apart from anything else. But you would also be, of course, seizing shipments of Russian oil and gas, which India and other countries had already paid for. Well, I needn't tell you how badly that would go down in India. I mean, Indian friends have said to me that, if a non-Western country did this, the West would regard it as piracy, and respond with armed force. So, I think what the West is also discovering is that things in the world are very different from the way they were 30 years ago. You cannot bully the rest of the world in the way that the West, got so used to doing for hundreds of years. Um, and that, you know, that constrains Western policy. Now, maybe the Europeans and the Americans are crazy enough to go on with these sanctions against India. But if so, they will pay a very heavy price, I think, geopolitically.
Certainly, sir. Thank you so much for your valuable time, sir. I'm sure your insights would give our audience a lot of clarity in terms of the recent developments around Ukraine and Russia conflict. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thanks a